The letter arrived in a plain white envelope, stamped with the royal crest. Inside, the words were cold and bureaucratic. You are liable to be detained and removed from the United Kingdom. For Paulette Wilson, who had lived in England since she was 10 years old, it felt like the ground had vanished beneath her feet. She had worked in British kitchens, paid her taxes, raised a daughter, and served food in the House of Commons itself. Yet now, the country she called home was telling her she didn't belong. Behind the letter was a storm brewing inside the British Home Office, one that would soon explode into one of the darkest political scandals in modern British history. The Windrush Deportation crisis would reveal how a nation that once called itself the heart of the Commonwealth turned against its own citizens. The story begins in the aftermath of World War II. Britain was rebuilding, desperate for workers. Ships like the HMT Empire Windrush arrived from the Caribbean, carrying men and women full of hope. They were invited to help repair the motherland, driving buses, nursing the sick, cleaning streets, laying bricks. In return, they were told they were British. Their children attended British schools, grew up under British skies, and called this land home. But decades later, many of those same people would be accused of being illegal immigrants. Inside the Home Office, the culture had shifted. By the early 2010s, under growing political pressure to appear tough on immigration, the government launched what it called the hostile environment policy. Landlords, doctors, and even employers were instructed to check immigration status. The goal, as then Home Secretary Theresa May said, was to create a really hostile environment for illegal immigrants. But the policy didn't just trap the undocumented. It began to swallow up citizens. Filing cabinets in the Home Office were filled with dust-covered folders, birth certificates, arrival stamps, boarding passes. Many of these records had been destroyed years earlier, during an archive cleanup. Without them, hundreds of Caribbean-born residents had no paper proof of their legal right to stay. They were told they needed evidence, decades of it, to prove they were British. Some had arrived as children on their parents' passports, others had never even left the country. It started quietly. A few pensioners found their benefits cut off. A man lost his job after an employer discovered he had no digital record of citizenship. But then came the deportation letters. Families torn apart overnight. Grandparents locked in detention centers. British citizens sent back to islands they hadn't seen in 50 years. Paulette's story was just one among hundreds. She remembered the knock on the door one cold morning in Wolverhampton. Immigration officers stood outside, holding her file. She was detained at Yarl's Wood, the same detention center used for asylum seekers. I kept saying, "I'm British. I grew up here," she told them. But her words meant nothing to the system that had already decided she didn't exist. Behind closed doors, junior staff at the Home Office started noticing something was wrong. Files flagged for deportation contained birth dates from the 1950s and 60s, people who had lived in the UK since childhood. One internal email, later leaked, showed a civil servant warning superiors. These individuals are likely to have legal status. The warning was ignored. The pressure from above was relentless. Targets had been set, numbers of removals that needed to be met each quarter. Deportations were seen as successes. Every case closed, every plane seat filled, meant another mark of efficiency. Inside the office, computers glowed late into the night. Analysts cross-referenced databases, scanning names and birthplaces. Caribbean surnames stood out. Files were fast-tracked for review. In 2018, a journalist from The Guardian, Amelia Gentleman, began piecing the story together. She met Paulette and others who had been detained, questioned, or stripped of their rights. Their stories shared eerie similarities: missing documents, ignored appeals, and the same cold letters signed by the Home Office. As Gentleman's reports grew, public outrage began to swell. But inside Whitehall, officials tried to contain the damage. They called it isolated cases. Then came the evidence. An internal memo leaked to the press revealed that the Home Office had been warned years earlier that the destruction of old landing cards, the very proof of legal entry for many, could lead to future difficulties. They destroyed them anyway. Another report showed that senior ministers were briefed about the possible wrongful detention of Windrush migrants, but had continued the policy regardless. The political fallout was swift and brutal. Theresa May, who had introduced the hostile environment as Home Secretary, was now Prime Minister. Her successor, Amber Rudd, faced mounting pressure. During a tense parliamentary hearing, Rudd denied that the Home Office had deportation targets, but leaked documents proved otherwise. When she was cornered with the evidence, she resigned, her voice trembling as she spoke of unintended consequences. The public was outraged. Protests erupted across London. The faces of Windrush citizens, old men in suits, elderly women clutching British passports, filled the front pages. They weren't faceless immigrants. They were neighbors, nurses, and veterans. One man, Anthony Bryan, had spent 5 weeks in a detention center. Another, Hubert Howard, died still waiting for his official apology. Inside the Home Office, the mood turned cold. Staff whispered in corridors, shredders hummed quietly, and internal emails were combed by investigators. Senior officials knew the crisis had spiraled beyond control. The press called it a betrayal. Parliament called it a scandal. But for the victims, it was something deeper. A wound that tore through decades of trust. In 2019, the government issued formal apologies. Compensation schemes were announced. "We are sorry for the distress caused," said the Home Secretary in a speech that sounded carefully written, almost rehearsed. But the apology came too late for many. Families had been separated, careers destroyed, and lives lost to stress and shame. For decades, the Windrush generation had been told they were part of Britain's story. They had sung its anthem, paid its taxes, and built its cities. Yet when the system turned against them, no one stood up. Not until the damage was done. Behind every case file was a life reduced to paperwork. One officer later confessed anonymously, "We were told to process, not to think." Another said the fear of questioning decisions was career suicide. Bureaucracy had become blind to humanity. The scandal became a mirror reflecting Britain's uneasy relationship with its colonial past. The same empire that had once reached across oceans now struggled to recognize those who came from its former colonies. The irony was cruel. The very citizens invited to help rebuild Britain were the ones it later tried to erase. When the official Windrush Lessons Learned review was published, it was damning. The report concluded that the crisis had been foreseeable and avoidable. It blamed institutional ignorance, systemic racism, and an obsession with numbers over people. The words were sharp, but the reality behind them was sharper still. Years later, Paulette Wilson stood outside Parliament, holding a placard that read, "We belong here." Her eyes, tired but fierce, stared straight ahead. Reporters asked if she forgave the government. She paused. "Forgiveness doesn't erase what they did," she said. "They tried to erase us." Her story became a symbol of resistance, not just for the Windrush generation, but for anyone crushed by bureaucracy's indifference. Inside the Home Office, the walls are still lined with neutral-colored paint, the fluorescent lights still buzz faintly, and the same corridors echo with the shuffle of paper. Policies have changed, names have changed, but the shadows remain. In 2020, Paulette died at 64. The government called her a hero of justice. Yet for many, her death was a reminder of how close the country came to forgetting its own citizens. Her ashes were scattered in Jamaica, the island she was almost deported to, but had never truly known. At the heart of the Windrush scandal lies a haunting truth. Citizenship, for some, was never guaranteed by birth or belonging, but by bureaucracy's mercy. As the years pass, files gather dust once again in the same Home Office cabinets. The letters have changed, the policies rebranded, but the fear lingers. The quiet dread that another envelope might arrive one day, declaring that you no longer belong to the place you call home. And in the silence of those offices, where fluorescent lights hum and computers glow, the question remains: how many more will the system forget before it learns to remember? Final line. Britain promised them a home, but in the end, it was the system that turned the key to the door and quietly shut it behind them.